in the word pandemic, the pan stands for global. And this is obviously a global catastrophe that everybody, the demos, is facing. But at the same time, this global catastrophe is brought about by millions of very close interactions, and each of which is unique in its circumstances and in the way that it is shaped and its motives. Is it the person that cares for you? Is it the person that you work with? Where are they happening and how? These interactions, human interactions, are shaped by global value chains that have disrupted and substituted the chains and cycles of nature, of life, and of care. And this is what makes the pandemic so serious and scary. Social Watch has been bringing to the attention of the United Nations reports by civil society coalitions for over 25 years on how the governments are meeting international commitments and human rights obligations. And year after year, we have been reporting in country after country how public services, in particular public health systems, and the formal and informal safety nets are being weakened by structural adjustment policies, austerity policies, which is basically a change in the name. Budget cuts in the health sector are being done in this moment in the middle of the pandemic in countries like Brazil or like Benin. And this is, we gather this information in our report. The result, of course, is an exacerbation of the inequalities and of the power asymmetries, both between countries as well as within countries. For many years, this has been happening, and we haven't been seeing it or focusing on it. Remember the MDGs, Millennium Development Goals? By focusing on extreme poverty, they shifted the attention and ignored inequalities that prospered around the world over the last 3 decades. In a similar way, a global health security index was prepared by the best world experts on health because they knew that such a pandemic was going to happen, and it was just a matter of time as to when that happened. Now, this was supposed to show how countries were prepared or not for a pandemic. And some of you might remember in February, President Trump of the US waved a paper in front of the cameras saying there is nothing to worry about, we are prepared. The paper he was waving was the Global Health Security Index that was saying that the US was the best prepared country in the world. Now, isn't there a mistake there? And how many thousands of lives has that mistake costed? I looked into that, we looked at it into the report, and what we find is that there is a lot of information backing up such an index, but the averages average on the one hand, the fact that the US is among the 20 worst countries in the world in terms of access to health. 20 worst countries in the world, not in the OECD, not among the high-income countries or the most developed countries of all the 200 countries in the world, the bottom 10% in terms of access to health. And the index says that, but then it averages that against the number of Nobel Peace Prizes in medicines or the research capacity and so on. So at the end, in those averages, you get an advice saying you are the best prepared in the world. By trying to count each tree, we do not see the forest. Now, the Spotlight report was created precisely to bring back the spotlight to where it should be. And for many years, we have already been saying the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, were already off track before the pandemic. Each and every one of them, when looked at separately. Now, this failure was the origin of massive protests around the world before the confinements starting earlier this year. One of those points that we have been raising, we have been making, and we make again, is that the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, are not to be taken and measured separately in a silo approach, but they should be integrated in a Sustainable Development Agenda. This is what Agenda 2030 itself says, not only because the goals are mutually supportive and access to clean water is obviously related with health, but also because the whole paradigm of what development is and means needs to change. Until COVID-19 changed all our paradigms, and when countries were faced to define, okay, what is essential, it ended up being that what is essential is the lowest paid jobs of the delivery people in a bicycle, and mainly the care work, unpaid in most of cases, or very badly paid by women, by migrants all around the world. Spotlight Report 2020 gathers evidence from the ground about this impact, about the unequal impact of COVID-19 that places most of the burden on women, on people that are already disempowered, like migrants, people with disabilities, ethnic and religious minorities, and so on. We are seeing common factors in what worked in those countries that seem to be more successful than others in COVID-19. And what works is integrated public health policies, confidence between people and the state, less inequalities. As simple as that. So that if this actual evidence is to be taken into account, it is very clear that we do not need to build back or build better or a great reset led by those billionaires that got richer with the pandemic, as Davos will be proposing to us next January, but actually 8 policy changes, of which we will be talking more in the following intervention. Actually, here among us, keep it secret, most of them are not radical at all. They are just about implementing the agendas already agreed internationally, like the 2030 agenda and the human rights laws. And multilateralism, as you know, is being attacked. Not of the many defects of the multilateral system, but because of its few virtues and the partial successes. So we should therefore not try to restore an old multilateralism that was never perfect, but rather transform it into people-centered, inclusive multilateralism. That is the message that we want to convey. It is essentially about the 2030 agenda, about human rights within planetary boundaries. This is what we hear from the ground. This is what people are saying, what they are reporting, and what they are screaming in the streets, as we hope to hear more by the following speakers.
In fact, the pandemic is a major crisis facing the Arab countries. It came after a turmoil resulted from the Arab Spring of 2011 and the new wave of protest in 2019. It's needless to say that the popular uprisings and protests are the clear manifestation of the growing systemic and multidimensional inequalities within and among the countries of the region. The pandemic has brought into sharp focus these structural inequalities affecting the entire economies in the Arab region. It's obvious that addressing inequalities necessitates thinking outside the box, as it was mentioned previously, and avoid doing business as usual. The 8 R's suggested by the Spotlight report for this year might become the rightful tools for success in empowering societies and building their resilience based on the conclusions of the COVID-19 experiences. The significant gap became apparent in the unfair health systems of some countries, regardless of their economic development. They were unable to respond quickly to urgent emergency needs to help thousands of patients and carriers of the virus. These challenges, brought about by the current epidemic crisis, revealed the inherent dangers in the trends promoting foreign investment to achieve growth without binding them to human rights and environmental standards or environmental protection standards, rather than promoting safety nets based on selective interventions to protect the most vulnerable. The speed in which the corona pandemic spread and related challenges were a further indication that there is no alternative to the state as the main protector of people at critical moments through adopting measures, policies, regulations for its containment. On the other hand, and indeed the network states in the latest Civic Space Monitor regional report that the world has been witnessing a trend towards a decline in the freedoms and spaces available for civil society organizations, especially in the Arab region. The space made available for the work of civil society is the basis on which any participatory democratic system is built and the basis for any development partnership. This shrinking space trend is part of a larger setback in protecting human rights in general. The repression practiced by the regimes against civil society activists and the dissenting voices is nothing but an attempt to suppress accountability and criticism. The report noticed also that the alliance of governments with private interest plays a major role as well in promoting these trends. Marginalized groups are being exposed to the most scandalous types of oppression when they claim their rights to equality and decent life. End of quote. The case of Lebanon sheds on the link between the failure of the state and the public institutions with corruption, which leads to unprecedented catastrophes. The sectarian and partisan quota system continues to practice neglect and corruption at the highest levels, leading to the August 4th explosion. All the parties of the regime are silent about the chaos because they benefit from the proceeds of corruption, each in their own way and through their own channels. All these practices plunged Lebanon into bankruptcy and led it to most painful moment in its history. Here comes the attention as a priority to reconsidering the role of the state, re-empowering public services, and redistribution as key elements to protect citizens' rights and security. A lot have been said about the ways to go out from the deadlock. However, the interlink between systemic barriers interrupting democratic changes at the local level with the global challenges are very obvious. Thus, the local and the global actors should enhance solidarity based on trust and common responsibility. This might also take into consideration disparities beyond the borders, which increase the concentration of power and wealth. Thus, in turn, stresses the need to reform the global governance as well as address the redistribution of wealth and economic power as prerequisite to face the systemic challenges.
So this is a quick snapshot of India versus Kerala. Just remember, on the left is the shadow of India, and you can see Kerala nestled at the southwest corner. It's a state which has 35 million people living in it. And I just want to give you a contrast of where Kerala is vis-a-vis India. If you look at some of the key socio-development indicators, you can see the maternal mortality rates, 130 per 100,000 in India, and it's 46 in Kerala. Infant mortality rate is only 7 compared to 30 in India. Sex ratio, a very key indicator for gender equality and gender progress. You have only 924 women compared to men in India because of sex selection and eliminating girls, while you have more than 1,000 more women in Kerala. Life expectancy in Kerala is almost 80 years compared to 69 in India, and literacy rate is 96%. So this is just to give you an idea that, you know, the state has been extraordinary in terms of its progress. So what are the key factors in Kerala's success? There are several points, and you know, I can speak for an hour on this, but I just want to give some highlights. But I think the main thing is that there was a social protection package, which was universal food distribution, interest-free loans, employment guarantee, waiver of utility bills, enhanced bandwidth for work from home, online counseling for violence, and labor protection. So there are 5 million women who are a part of 300,000 groups, which are neighborhood groups. And they're very inclusive. They include transgender group, disabled groups, and senior women. There's a very strong democratic decentralization, which has been the highlight in our report. And basically, it's not about municipalities and the local self-governance institution. It's about going further down to what are called panchayats in the village level. There are more than 1,000 such self-governed governing institutions in Kerala. And here, the interesting part, it is not just you know, devolution of power at the local level, but it's also devolution of state budgets and financial resources. I think that is the key. And at this level, you have more than 50% of the women as elected grassroots, at the grassroots as leaders. The other thing about Kerala that really helped during COVID was an extraordinarily robust public health system. And you have the primary healthcare systems working very well. And during COVID, the state has done fully free testing and treatment for anyone who's COVID positive, plus essential treatment like sexual and reproductive health and rights, TB, cancer, and other care were taken care of. There's a strong right to food, health, employment guarantee, and education also. And this continued in very creative ways during COVID. And all this is because of a very long-term political culture and public discourse of rights and entitlement that's more than 100 years old. So I just want to focus a bit on the gender issue. So while Kerala is certainly ahead, as we saw, but there are certain wrinkles in the whole, in the state in terms of violence against women, which is high. And during the pandemic, it was like another silent pandemic. And what did Kerala do about it? They had several online counseling centers for women who were in distress, and also a lot of mental health counseling. I mean, this is the key thing. And it's regardless of women, anyone, because, you know, it's about lockdowns, it's about a whole lot of insecurity. There was lots of mental health counseling that was opened up. And for women, even those who required it, they even had community level counseling. So any serious cases were followed up. So it was not very impersonal. In terms of the frontline workers, one of the big issues was about elsewhere in India was about lack of PPEs and safety kits, etc. The frontline workers in Kerala were not only given all the safety measures, but their salary was enhanced to take on the extra burdens. Elderly care, especially for single, destitute, and older single women, was ensured doorstep delivery of all essential services. Elders in Kerala have 3 visits per week. One set of volunteers give them grocery and food. Another set of volunteers come and look at their health, take care of medicines, connect them to telemedicines if need be. And a third set are just available for any other help that they need. And even maternal health was a big priority. So deliveries, antenatal checkups, everything went on as per WHO guidelines. Now, how is all this possible? This is also possible because of this Kudumbasri, with those 5 million women who are at the grassroots and working along with the local self-governance institutions. So that is the architecture of governance in Kerala, where they work very closely and everything is decided at the local level. So therefore, anyone who has a problem with health is taken care of at the local level without having to go to the tertiary care. And they have this first-line COVID center at the local level. And only for cases that become serious, then they are kind of transferred to the specialty hospital. So they have a very well-oiled system, and the women and the frontline workers work in tandem to really keep in touch and to see that, you know, everyone who reports and is tested positive is taken care of. This governance system is also about, you know, looking at even education. So the last point I want to make about this is that with the work from home, school from home, they have managed to see that every child in Kerala, of course there were some hiccups, has access to the classes, online classes. And this they did at the community level. There was a huge campaign and mobilization to donate smartphones or donate television. They did something very smart. They had this TV programs called Witters, which is about streaming in classes from grade 1 to grade 12 online. So you can see it on the smartphone, you can see it on the TV. So these are some of the steps that Kerala state undertook to deal with COVID. And the point is that this huge culture of rights and people demanding from below and the state being transparent and accountable, especially with the decentralization of governance, has really helped during COVID, especially during a very difficult time.
The Spotlight report argues that policy responses to COVID-19 must not return us to the deeply dysfunctional status quo that we had before the pandemic. The multiple crises that we're facing can only be overcome if the massive power asymmetries within and between our societies are reduced. And we argue that that requires a shift not only in policies, as the title of the report suggests, but in systems and in structures, and also in the narratives that sustain these systems and structures. So we present what we see as 8 building blocks of an agenda for systemic change, grounded in the primacy of human rights, gender justice, and environmental sustainability. The first building block is revaluing the importance of care in societies. The pandemic has driven home the essential role of care work in our societies, but also it's driven home how devalued, how badly paid, or how unpaid care is, and how disproportionately it falls on women. And we argue in the report that revaluing, redistributing, and resourcing care work is essential to building a more rights-based economy emerging from the current crisis. The second building block is re-empowering public services. Around the world, we've seen the consequences of the steady erosion of public health services and other services through austerity cuts, through privatization, through understaffing. And we make a human rights-based case for robustly financed public services. And we point to the remarkable wave of, for example, remunicipalization as evidence that bringing services back into public control is not only possible, but actually popular in many countries. The third is rebalancing global and local value chains. The pandemic has exposed the vulnerabilities generated by an over-reliance on global value chains. But it also offers the opportunity to transition away from the extractive, export-driven development model that has dominated up to now towards more vibrant, regenerative local economies, rebuilding what we call the socio-ecological contract, founded again on human rights and the sustainable use of ecological resources. The fourth element is reinforcing the shift towards climate justice. The report highlights how many countries' economic responses to the crisis have paid very little regard to their ecological consequences, and yet it's critical that we use this juncture as an opportunity to advance a green economy. The fifth building block of our agenda is redistributing economic power and resources. Redistribution is at the heart of this agenda. The fiscal recovery packages put in place by many governments and international institutions should have been a critical means for tackling the inequalities exposed by COVID, but many have instead responded to corporate interests rather than the rights of those most affected. So we propose in the report a suite of redistributive fiscal measures, including new or increased taxes on wealth and excess profits, particularly given how wealth concentration has become more acute during the crisis. It's worth noting that as of July 2020, billionaires in the US, including many of the big tech giants, had increased their net worth by more than $600 billion. Our sixth point is the re-regulation of global finance. The crisis has generated new political impetus for the reform and democratization of the international financial architecture, with particular momentum around issues of debt cancellation and restructuring. We make the case in the report for an independent sovereign debt workout mechanism and a new intergovernmental tax body under UN auspices to address the critical and chronic problems of global tax dodging facilitated by tax havens and a skewed global tax system. Our seventh building block is reinventing multilateral solidarity. The pandemic has hit at a time when multilateralism and international cooperation are at an all-time low, as Roberto and others have said. We, in the report, reframe the notion of multilateral solidarity in light of fundamental human rights principles, such as the duty of governments to respect human rights beyond their borders. And finally, the eighth building block is redefining measures of development and progress. This basically addresses the geopolitics of measurement. We highlight how, despite the SDG commitment to develop measures of progress that go beyond GDP, economic growth remains the prevailing metric in the dominant neo-colonial development paradigm. And that's illustrated in the report, as Roberto mentioned, through the example of the Global Health Security Index. Now, we do not pretend that this is an exhaustive or comprehensive agenda. It's not radical as in the sense that some of these proposals have been around for a while and are moving more into the mainstream, but they're radical in the sense that they go to the roots of the problems. And that's very much in keeping with the ethos and spirit of the Spotlight report. These are some of the most critical axes along which the many organizations and networks which are part of this initiative believe we can shift how and where power is vested and exercised.
So I'm really pleased that we are doing this report and continue to do this report, and that we need to develop ways, strengthen our ways of actually engaging with. We engage a lot, but maybe we need to shout a little bit louder. Maybe we should have protests outside the UN headquarters. My comments completely accompany the outline that Ignacio has given us of the full range of the various measures, spaces, policy changes, recommendations that are needed. Because I want to say that money isn't everything, and it will not secure our human rights, and it certainly isn't going to protect our common home, the planet. But it's also extremely relevant when it's concentrated in the wrong hands, as we've heard, chasing non-solutions, as we know, and often, frankly, really amplifying the problems that we're addressing. So, for example, for many decades, there's been far more invested in military expenditures than in people, peace, and planet. And despite the protestations of the lack of money, particularly in the public purse, we've seen over the decades trillions chasing currency speculation, sloshing between stock markets in different countries because of the capital, the free market, as it were, in capital flows. And now, of course, we're confronted with, because of COVID, with the vaccine casino. If somebody ever told us that the public sector couldn't generate money, I think they're going to have to kind of go back and revisit that particular line of argument. So today, this approach to solving problems is to such an extreme extent that we are confronted with the quote unquote ugly word financialization solution of just about everything, which is witnessed in land grabs, which is invested in environmental services, which is an approach to healthcare systems and so on. The thinking being quite straightforwardly that if you turn anything into a commodity or a derivative, the money will come. I think we're also seeing that some of the public finance is also feeling like it's a small side governments. We don't have enough resources. Therefore, we have to use our limited public resources to kind of leverage, to give incentives to the private sector to actually come into solving these problems, which reinforces this same financialization, mindset in all kinds of ways. So to accompany everything else that we're saying, I think we really need a completely new funding compact, not to buy peace and justice, but because the way the current setup is working has actually shrunken our policy space. It's shrunken policy space not only in fiscal area with regard to taxation, it's shrunken policy space in terms of our ability to fight for our human rights. It's shrunken policy space certainly at the global level, which is contributing in lots of cases to the conversation about the crisis in multilateralism. And so I think that for our mobilizing, for one of the things that is really valuable about the way in which those of us who come together in this initiative around Spotlight is that it means that we bring our commitments and our concerns into this collective space, and we challenge each other not to be in our own silos, but in fact to do more than that, to bring our knowledge, our commitment, our work with people and women everywhere into a space which actually hopefully helps us to work together to confront the policy imbalances that we face, and gives us strength with each other, recognizing what has happened in terms of the policy dynamics and the control, if you like, of the decision-making process, but gives us the solidarity amongst ourselves to actually add a demand for a completely new funding compact to accompany all of the other compacts that we are facing. It relates to what has been said already, whether we want a debt workout mechanism. And I think we all feel challenged that we either don't know enough about these issues, or if we don't concentrate, if we get into these other areas, we lose our commitment and our connection with grassroots, etc. I think together that's not true. So as you know, I wrote a piece on multilateral solidarity and identified some number of things in there. What I'd like to add for all of us today is our solidarity. And I really appreciate our solidarity, and I really appreciate that the Spotlight report is a very valuable vehicle for all of us in supporting each other in that area. Thank you.